We've all heard this idea of working smarter and not harder. Does that sound like something that is easier said than done? Do you feel that efficiency might sometimes compromise your teaching and how and what students are learning? In this episode, I take on this idea with Amy Marshal, who is a Spanish teacher in Massachusetts. Amy offers lots of tips, insights, and suggestions for saving you time as a language teacher, while not compromising the effectiveness of your teaching and what your students learn. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your week to listen to a podcast about language teaching. Because I tell you every week doesn't mean that you don't need to hear it again. But you are an incredible language teacher because you're listening to a podcast about language teaching. So I know that you're doing great stuff. So thank you so much for going that extra mile. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about working smarter and not harder. Now, this is probably something you've heard, but we're going to talk about it very specifically in the world of being a language teacher. Joining me today to help us really wrap our brains around working smarter and not harder with lots of concrete ideas is Amy Marshal. Now, Amy Marshal is definitely a person you've seen out there in the conference world. You've seen her on social media, but she is a Spanish teacher who's been teaching for about 24 years. Half of that time was in high school. Half of that time was in middle school. So she's had her chance to teach all over the realms. And she actually lives in Connecticut, but teaches in Massachusetts. So this is the first time I've had a teacher who lives in a different state than where they teach, which is interesting. But you may have seen her presenting at Fluency Matters or the CI Summit and also at the Conference in the Cloud. And Amy, it is such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
One thing I wanted to ask you specifically about before we get into this conversation is your most recent conference that you did. Can you tell us about that? It's very intriguing.
Yes. Oh, I'm so excited. I just got back from an amazing trip to China, Guangzhou, China, for TCI China was the name of the conference. And there was a group of presenters that we all went over and presented for a week, teaching educators that teach English as well as Chinese. And we just had so much fun. Learned so much from people from all over the world. It was just so cool to connect with different teachers.
What were your topics that you were presenting on while you were there?
So I was presenting on low-no prep reading strategies, as well as what a novice CI classroom looks like. I also did a whole presentation on my acquisition journey to learn Mandarin, which I've been working on. So I worked on several different things, some games for the classroom. It was exciting to be able to share all these. And you always get great ideas from people when you're presenting, people just sharing their experiences with similar things. So it was a really rich time.
I think we get into our silo of United States or even North American teaching and CI teaching and all of that. And so I'm curious what your experience was taking these CI focused techniques to China. And did you feel like there was a common understanding of it, or did you feel like more you were introducing these concepts?
Well, I felt like it wasn't unlike here, where you've got people that are very CI oriented and then people that have never really experienced it. So it was cool to see people that have implemented some things in their classroom and how it works for them. And then to see light bulbs go on with other people like, oh, there's a different way to do this. So it was really the whole gamut. It was exciting to share with all levels of that.
Sounds like a wonderful time. So
yeah, it was fantastic.
So let's start talking about this idea of working smarter and not harder. And I noticed that one of the things you were presenting on was those low prep activities, which I'm sure is going to come into here somewhere. We're working smarter, not harder. So that was a a little bit of a sort of breadcrumb for what we're going to be getting into. But before we get into the specifics, can you start by explaining what that means to work smarter and not harder, particularly in our contexts of a world language classroom?
I have a great quote, first of all, but Jason, I'm not sure if it says fried or freed, but it's workaholics aren't heroes. They don't save the day. They just use it up. The real hero is home because they figured out a faster way. And that resonates with me. How many years as a teacher did I break my back at work, at home, all those things? And in my head, when I come home from school, I want to be a mom. I want to be a wife. And when I'm at work, I want to be a fantastic teacher. And they're not mutually exclusive. It's just, how do you figure out to be your best you wherever you are without sacrificing? And it's possible. It's just got to be strategic.
Have you found that balance of keeping school at school and not have it infiltrate your family personal life?
Yes, I absolutely have. I rarely take anything home from work with me. The only time I take something home from work with me is if I'm having so much fun with it that I want to continue to play with it in my free time. But otherwise, it stays in the classroom and I'm strategic about how I get things done at school.
Let's talk about being strategic and getting those things at school, right? So what are some of those strategies, those ways that you're being strategic so that you are in fact being more efficient and I guess more effective than in the classroom? So I guess this is coming from a place where I'm asking the question of what's the unnecessary work that I'm doing? Right.
Okay, so I would say that I've broken it into like 3 categories. Like the way I think about it is simplifying grading practices, simplifying classroom activities, and then using AI to fill in the gaps. Not to do the heavy lifting, but sometimes just to take the pressure off. So if I were going to rattle off some grading practices, simplifying your gradebook setup, formative, summative, or presentational, interpretive, formative, simple things like that so that you don't have all these different crazy categories you're working with. Not grading every paper. We live in a world where we're telling kids that they can practice and, it's important to practice and it's important to make mistakes. And then we hammer all their errors, right? Let's entertain the idea of practicing without having to grade that. Sometimes we do, and everybody has different requirements at their different schools, right? So you got to do what you've got to do at your school. But I don't grade every paper. I use one rubric for all assignments. I've got one presentational rubric. I've got one interpersonal rubric. I've got one interpretive rubric.
If you think back to a time where maybe you were a teacher earlier on in your career when your grade book was a little more convoluted, had all these different categories. So what were some of those early categories that you had and how did you streamline it? And if you could tell us exactly what it looks like today.
Yeah, I started out as a traditional grammar teacher. I had tests and quizzes and homework and participation and I had all of the things. And now I do presentational, interpretive, and a small formative portion on my gradebook. It keeps it simple. And again, you adjust that for however works for you. But I've taken out a lot of the extraneous things. So, I do that. I'm not correcting every mistake on a paper that I do correct. I'm not correcting every paper. And then I'm using my time. So I'm using every minute I have at school. If I've got papers to grade, then I'm not socializing. And if I don't, then I'm taking some time for myself. And some days I grade, some days I don't.
This past year, over the last 2 years, I had transitioned my grade book to look similar by the modes. And one of the hurdles that I came up with, and I'm curious if you had this hurdle and how you dealt with it, but it was the student expectations.
Yes.
The student expectations. So when I would hand something back and it didn't have a bunch of red marks on it, and they saw everything they did wrong, because that's what every teacher has always done. And that's what their other teachers in their other classes do. And so they would sort of, they wanted all of it. They weren't going to do anything with it, but they were so in this position of expecting a test grade and a quiz grade And
Yes.
so it was a bit of a struggle for me. And so I'm curious how you managed that.
Well, I frame it for them from the beginning. When they're doing an assessment for me, this is an opportunity for you to show off and show me what you can do. And in that, I'm going to then react to it. And I ask students, and this comes from Meredith White. If they want those kinds of corrective feedback, I'll do it for them. If you say, correct it, I'm happy to do that. If they don't, do you want me to comment on your content? I love to comment. Oh, that's a great idea. Oh, fun story. Oh, I love it. Did you really do that? And just share a quick comment every now and again on what they've done. So it's certainly possible to ask if they want it. And then just give them feedback. So if I usually have the rubric on their paper, or I have a copy in their notebook so that they can say, okay, I've given you this and I circled this. So you know there is feedback.
That's looking at the streamlining our grading system. We'll talk about AI a little bit after, but in terms of the activities that you're doing. So what are some examples of low prep activities? You actually referenced this about your time in China.
Yeah, yes. Okay, so just real quickly, what I do is I take my activities and I group them. What are my no prep activities? Or what are my low prep activities? So I kind of have like this list of my go-to activities so I can pick them out real quickly. Also, I don't get stuck on doing the same thing over and over again, which my brain often does. Mm-hmm. But I love reading activities. If you have a text that you're working with, it doesn't matter what kind of a text. If you created a story and done a write and discuss, or you have a book that you're working on and you're looking at a chapter, or something from a textbook. It works for anything. I love to do a volleyball translation. Pair students up. Student 1 reads it in the target language. Student 2 then does that sentence in English. And then the next sentence, they trade roles and you go back and forth. That's a great one. I love when you have a text, having students have a copy of the text, a piece of blank paper or a dry erase board or whatever you're drawing on, and have a student pick a sentence from the text and illustrate it. And the other student does the same. And then at the end of the time that you give them, they trade drawings and see if they can find the correct sentence in the thing. It's so much fun. And all they're doing is reading over and over and over again, trying to find the sentence. So it's lots of great repetition that they're getting. I love to take a text and I call it story bulking. You're either going to have them add words to a certain number of words to a certain number of sentences, or add sentences to the text. So maybe I give them a short story and I say, add 3 sentences to the story. And then we can keep rereading the story and adding in different sentences, and it changes the story, but it's still the same input that we want them to be hearing, the same target structures. Or we've added words. It's a great way for them to use adjectives and connecting words to change sentences.
Those are 3 great activities that required absolutely no prep.
Yeah, there's so many. And it's just, and I just keep a list. So I know, okay, I did that one this week. I won't do that one next week. I'll do this one.
Yeah.
And so it keeps it fresh for the kids.
Mm-hmm. And once the students know how to do it, then you can kind of pull it out anytime. It's just that first time you have to explain it. But after that, here we go.
Super easy. Yeah, absolutely. This last year, I dove into going into the old-fashioned games and doing Chutes and Ladders, Tic-Tac-Toe, Connect 4, and doing things like that, where I have a game board that I project up on the screen and I ask questions about the text, and they're in groups. And if their group answers correctly, they get to roll the die and move on the Chutes and Ladders board. And Chutes and Ladders is a long game. It can go on forever. I literally take a picture at the end of class. Like we don't finish the game. I take a picture. Okay, this is where we end. Next time we do a review game, we'll put it up and they get same groups and they move ahead. And it's like an ongoing competition that they have fun with.
What sort of prompts might you use in the Chutes and Ladders game? What kind of questions might you be asking?
I just ask comprehension questions about a story. So same thing. If you've had a text that you've worked with, I ask them a question about the story or a translation about the story that they could do. Mm-hmm. And you could do it with conversation questions. You could do it with anything. A lot of times I'm saving myself the effort, not creating those questions. I'm throwing the story into AI and saying, write 20 comprehension questions at novice mid-level or novice high level. And boom, there you have it.
Yeah. Well, you made the transition to AI there, so let's go. So
All right.
you mentioned one way that you're using AI. So how else have you leveraged AI in your teaching?
Okay, so I have used it for so many things. It kind of opens you do one thing and you're like, wow, could it do this as well? Could it do that? I use it to create any type of questions. I use it to create quotes for a story that had, that they've read, write quotes that this character would have said. You put the story in and ask it to make quotes, and it does amazing things. Create a close, create differentiated texts. Could you write this text at novice, high level, and intermediate low, right? And it'll do that. Creating a summary, creating a glossary. It does everything. You can create presentations, but those are like the basic ones for your lesson planning. Mm-hmm. You can create an assessment. You can do really anything. And it's just the key of tweaking the prompts and teaching. Mm-hmm. You just treat your conversations with AI like they're ongoing conversation.
Mm-hmm. Do you have your AI go-to tools that you're using?
I do. So I use ChatGPT or you.com kind of interchangeably. I love Diffit for making a lesson plan. It gives you vocabulary in your target language. You can say what grade level. So if I'm working with novice level language, I can put in like second grade Spanish and it'll create like on a whim. Like if I'm at the last moment and let's just do a lesson about whatever let's just say Cinco de Mayo and boom, put it in. It'll come up with images and questions and vocabulary and all those things. Mm-hmm. So I love that. I love Gamma for presentation, if I need to create presentations. Twee as well is great at creating questions for stories that you have. I loved using that.
I think the more language teachers are using them and using language like novice high or intermediate mm-hmm. low, because I felt earlier on I had to say novice high meant chunked phrases, not intermediate low meant single sentences. But now it's getting to the point that if you say actful, intermediate, low, it's had that prompt enough that now it understands it.
It knows it, yeah. And what I love, especially about ChatGPT, is that you can put in your descriptors of what every one of your prompts should keep in mind. Like, keep in mind that I'm teaching Spanish 1 and 2, and that I need this to be blah, blah, blah. And so it's got all of these little parameters to keep its prompts to, and it works out fantastically.
Yeah. One of the other things I have learned to do, particularly in I think they call them dialogues on ChatGPT, where mm-hmm. you're having the conversation,
yes.
is I used to start a new one each time.
Yes.
And now I'm like, oh, it's the same story. I'm going to go to the same one and I'm going to use the same story rather than having to redo it.
Exactly.
And it's one of those things like, well, of course, but I wasn't doing early on.
Well, you don't think of it like you're having a conversation with a person, right? But I mean, you kind of, if you think of it that way, let's pick up where we left off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I still say please in every prompt. I can't help it.
I do too. It's always good to be polite. Our manners matter.
Thank you so much. Because I'm afraid if I go back the next time, they're like, I'm not helping you this time. You were wrong.
I know. That's hysterical. Yes, I do the same thing. You never know when there's really a person on the other end listening. They want to know.
Yeah. So I'm curious again about more of the AI tools, as we tend to use them, at least I have, to have a reading text or it's creating questions. Have you tried to have it create interpersonal activities? Has that worked well for you?
I've asked it to create an interview from a text. So it has it interviews a character for me. So in that respect, yes, I think with the right prompts, yeah, I've had it create stories for me with the right framing. The one new tool that everybody's talking about is Suno, Sunno, which you can put in a prompt and it'll create a song for you. And super, super comprehensible. It's easily, if you're teaching music in your class and using popular music, these songs you can tailor them so that they work really well. Tons of fun.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's just every time I have a conversation about AI, I hear about 2 or 3 new ones that I didn't hear about before. It's getting very overwhelming.
And Suno is super easy. I did it just as a joke. I was like, this isn't going to work. And I typed in in Spanish, there is a boy that has a dog, and like just gave it like 3 or 4 short sentences, and it came out with this amazing song. So, I mean, like, it's just so easy to make your life easier. Like, I can create a story in class, have it typed up, and all I have to do then is, while my students are doing something quick, copy and paste it in and say, create 15 questions about this. And then I can play a game or take a summary of that story, have your students do a shrinking summary and then use that to create a Suno song that you can then do with them. And they already know the background of it.
I'm hoping you can help maybe with some of our listeners who might be thinking that they are that workaholic person you mentioned at the beginning in the quote, right? That it has to look like I'm working. And that's where I get my value, recognition, my worth, and all of that. So as teachers are balancing this idea of having to have this robust curriculum and teaching, but at the same time, leaving at the end of the school day and not taking work home with you. So I guess maybe getting a little woo-woo about it, but in terms of getting teachers over that hurdle, because you've been at this a little bit of time, so you've gotten to this place where you're comfortable with it. So for that teacher that feels like I need to look like and feel like I'm doing a lot of work to be productive, how can you help us grapple with that?
We're not always kind to ourselves. We don't always show ourselves a lot of grace. When you're in that classroom, like, the energy that it takes to do what we do is inconceivable to people that have not done it. And we always feel like we're keeping up with the Joneses. But the fact is, you work hard while you're there at school. People go home after their jobs at the end of the day, and they leave their jobs. It's a matter of giving yourself permission. Give yourself permission to leave work. There's something called Parkinson's Law, and it states that your task will expand to fill the time that you have available for it. You've got to not make yourself available all the time. You've got to, and you've got to combine hard work and smart work, and that makes efficient work. So do like tasks together, be mindful of when you're hanging out with your colleagues and when you could be doing work so that you don't have to take it home. On a day that I've given an assessment, I'm not hanging out with my teachers in the teacher lounge and doing that. I'm getting it done so that I don't have to take it home. Because I'm also very mindful about, I like to get it back to the kids the next day. Create things that are easy to assess. Every once in a while, you have to do a longer one, but like, not every assessment needs to be a long, drawn out thing either. Advocate for yourself. It's a powerful tool to learn how to say no. And don't feel like using AI is cheating. It's not. Because if you can use AI to make your tasks get done quicker so that you can be more on task with your students in the classroom, that is not wrong. We're not, you're using things to help you be more effective so that you have more gas in the tank in the classroom.
So I think when it comes to AI, we're in a transition period with it right now where people are sort of seeing it as cheating, or I couldn't do that. That's cheating. I think we're going to get to a place where we're going to understand that you need to have expertise to recognize the quality of what's produced. That's where our expertise comes in. If you have it create a story and it's riddled with grammar errors and spelling mistakes or incorrect information, Mexico City is the capital of Colombia. Like, your expertise is sort of as the ultimate proofreader and the quality of the content. And the quality control. So I hope we get to a little bit more of a place like that.
Absolutely. I mean, because I think especially like in the realm of using it to create questions for your class, like about a text, we can all do that. But how is my time better spent? Let's let the AI create it. I can read it over and see which ones I like and don't like. And then I am much more able to plug in and be fresh and energetic and ready to engage with my students because I haven't had to be so micro-focused on the tiny, minute details.
Can you give us some recommendations? You're clearly learning from someplace in terms of people,
Mhm.
conferences, books, and everything. You're
Yeah,
figuring all
yeah.
out. You're figuring out a lot on your own. I want to discount that at all. But
Gosh,
what
yes.
could you recommend to us?
Yeah, I mean, I've learned there's so many people have poured into me and shared things. I love SenoraChase.com. You can't go wrong with her blog. She has so many fantastic ideas for games, for activities in the class, and ways to connect with students. Huge. And you can't go wrong with the Comprehensible Classroom blog. And that's, that was one of the primary ones that really started my mind to go in a different direction and start thinking about how I could do things a little bit differently. So I highly recommend those.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And so how can teachers be connecting with you to collaborate, learn more about you and what you're doing?
I'm on LinkedIn as Amy Marshal. I am on Instagram as Zona de Profes. I have a YouTube channel where I post videos of myself teaching, which is also Zona de Profes. And my email is zonadeprofes@gmail.com. And I love to collaborate. I love to hear from teachers.
Wonderful. I will make sure the links to all of that are in the show notes so that teachers can reach out directly to you and head over to your YouTube channel to see you in action. That's going to be the best part.
A little bit of crazy.
That is, hey, there's nothing like a little bit of crazy or a lot of crazy.
Right? Yeah.
So I always like to leave teachers with a hearty piece of advice at the end. So what can you share with us?
Have a sense of humor about yourself. We learn by failure. We're all sick of hearing about growth mindset, but bounce back in the wake of failure. Look at that as a growing experience. Falter, examine, and grow. As many years as I've been doing this, I have bad lessons. And the key to me being better is that at the end of a lesson, I go, what went well? And what could I be doing better? Okay, so this stunk and that's okay. How would I do it different so that it would work better? Does the whole lesson need to go out? Or could it be tweaked a little bit? Was there something that I did that, what was off? Be realistic with yourself. We have to know what our strengths and our weaknesses are. And if you're realistic in those and you can say, I'm really good at this and I need to work on this. If you have that growth mindset and be willing to those videos on my YouTube channel are because I needed to assess what I was doing. So I committed to videoing myself regularly so that I could be my own worst critic.
Excellent. Well, Amy Marshal, this has been an absolute pleasure talking shop with you and learning from you and just bringing that to all of our listeners. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been great.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Amy Marshal? I sure hope you're seeing some ways to streamline your planning and activities so that you can be a little more efficient and productive. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Amy Marshal. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram @WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.